All right. Welcome back. Another panel of Kaiju Masterclass. My name's Kyle Byrd. I'm one half of the Kaiju Transmissions podcast and one of the founding members of the Kaiju Masterclass convention. And I'm joined by...
I'm Matt Parmley, also one half of the Kaiju Masterclass organizational crew. Not one half, sorry, the podcast. I am one part of the organizational crew. We also have...
we are lucky to have two of our special guests joining us for this. We have the author of Kaiju for Hipsters, which is an excellent book, in the Mazer Patrol blog, as well as one of the essays in the recent Arrow Daimajin box set, Kevin Derendorf.
Hello.
And another special guest that we're lucky to have this year is the author of The Lost Films, Kong Unmade, The Lost Films fanzine, Classic Monsters Unmade, likes writing a lot about movies that didn't get made. That's John LeMay.
Hey guys, I'm not part of Kaiju Transmissions, but I do wear the shirt and I really like it. So.
So yeah, we're here to talk about Gorgo, which came out in 1961. So it's celebrating an anniversary this year. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about Gorgo's overall reputation in the giant monster landscape, and also some of the things that people might not know. A big part of that is going to be, at one point, this was going to be a Japanese co-production. So at one point, this was going to be a co-production between the UK and Japan. Now, Gorgo is usually brought up in sequence with, a lot of the kind of Godzilla knockoff films like Gappa or Gulala or Yongari. But Gorgo really predates a lot of those. In fact, Gorgo is a movie that came out at a time when the kaiju genre was really in its infancy. We'd had the two Godzilla films from Japan, and Rodan and Varan, I believe. And then here we had, King Kong and Son of Kong, and a couple giant insect movies, but it wasn't a genre with a proven formula really until later. And in fact, Gorgo, instead of being a knockoff, Gorgo actually established a lot of the tropes that we would see in Japanese kaiju movies and American monster movies, really to this day. So Gorgo really is not, in my opinion, a Godzilla imitator. And in fact, Gorgo was directed and has an uncredited writing credit, but by a man named Eugene Laurier, who I'll talk about in just a moment. But he also directed The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which was not only Ray Harryhausen's first feature as a stop-motion animator, but also, as many of us know, one of the movies that greatly inspired the creation of Godzilla. So just to kind of push back on the knockoff accusation a bit more, this is actually a movie made by the person that directed a movie that some would say Godzilla was a bit of a knockoff. So yeah, from a modern perspective, I think it's easy to write Gorgo off in that way, but it really was a more innovative film, and a lot of the things they were doing with special effects, with the suits and things like that, were groundbreaking at the time, and no one was really doing things like what they were doing. So speaking of, this movie being a co-production between Japan and the UK at one point, we should talk about the big producers of Gorgo, the King brothers, who are rather infamous, I think.
Yeah, so the King brothers, Frank Herman and Maurice Kaczynski, they later changed their surname to King. They, of course, founded King Brothers Productions in 1941. They actually gained their wealth through slot machines and horse racing, but their entry into film actually began with panorams, which were basically these 16-millimeter films projected against a glass screen. They would have 2 or 3 minute reels. Think of it like a glorified jukebox. You might have like maybe a musician playing or like a trapeze artist. But when they weren't getting the financial returns back on that idea, they basically said, hey, why don't we turn our attention to feature-length film production? So their first film was actually called Paper Bullets. It was shot in about 6 days, and it was released through a company called Producers Releasing Corporation. The Kings brothers negotiated a 50% cut of the profit, and the movie did well enough because it was shot, you know, over that 6-day period, not a whole lot of cost. It did well enough to where they actually was able to get the profit to basically start their production company. And from there, they began to make a bunch of different movies. So one thing I want to go back to is that Byrd talked about kind of their infamous history. Well, these are noted criminals. In fact, in 1940, they were charged with tax evasion along with one of their sisters. And then in 1945, they released a movie called Dillinger. And Dillinger was put out by Monogram Pictures, which we'll talk about here in a second. But it was written by Philip Jordan, and he would work for the King brothers on numerous different occasions, writing a lot of their films. But when he describes him, I'm actually just going to read one of his quotes. He said, when I first met them, they weren't gangsters, but they had investments in slot machines, and they were probably running something illegal in town. Nobody questioned it. They had a few bucks. They weren't rich, but they had some money. They were very honest, and they always paid me. So he basically corroborates the idea that these are kind of seedy individuals. And then from the book, The Black Dahlia Files, which is, of course, about the Black Dahlia murder, it talks about how there was some of the mob money that was coming out of New York was laundered through what they referred to as the club. And basically, they had a bank, the Morgan Guarantee Bank in New York City. Money from the club was often distributed to George Burroughs, who was the vice president and treasurer of Monogram, which is the picture on the slide right now. And one of the studio's most successful pictures was the Dillinger Picture, which was produced by the King brothers. And this book goes out and flat out says this was a family of Hollywood gangsters who made the film as a tribute to one of their fallen idols. Dillinger, of course, is a noted and notorious gangster. And then actually Ted Newsom, film historian, who did the Ninth Wonder of the World, The Making of Gorgo, also refers to them as criminals. So we have a bunch of people using essentially mob money to make and finance all of their different movies. And then in one other note that I think is really interesting, of course, if you don't care about where you're financing your movies, mob money or otherwise, you probably don't care about who gets the credit for screenwriting. In 1956, the King brothers actually released the movie called The Brave One. But The Brave One actually was, as Willis O'Brien alleges, an idea that was actually stolen from him. He had taken that movie, or he had written a script called Emilio and Galuso, or Emilio and the Bull. There's a couple different variations on the name. But he had sold that to Jesse Lasky Jr., who would eventually go on to found what would become Paramount Pictures. And then he sold that to film producers, the Nassau brothers, under the title Valley of the Mist. Valley of the Mist was interesting because that actually would be the basis for the story of Valley of Gwangi, as well as the Beast from Hollow Mountain. And I mentioned Emilio and the Bull. You can actually see the bull right there in the picture as kind of the holdovers from the original script. Of course, this would not be the first time that Willis O'Brien would have an idea taken from him. We all know the history of Godzilla, or King Kong versus Godzilla in 1962. But also really important to note is that Dalton Trumbo, who's seated on the left, he actually won an Academy Award for The Brave One. And he was part of what they call the Red Scare. So back during, Cold War era, you had all these directors, actors, screenwriters who essentially get blacklisted in Hollywood. And the only way that they can find work, especially in Trumbo's case, is he had to write under a different name. And in fact, when he won an Academy Award, they had to present it to somebody else on stage because he was on that blacklist. And we're not going to cover all the different aspects of the Red Scare, but I think it's really, really interesting history. And it kind of shows all the different issues that are going on within Kings Brothers Productions. Of course, Kings Brothers also releases the American version of Rodan in 1957. And so there's actually a clip of stock footage that appears both in Rodan and in Gorgo later on. And if you think about kind of the history of King Kong getting re-released in 1952, you have The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, then you have Godzilla, and then you have Rodan. You can kind of see the evolution of, okay, now the Kings Brothers want to get involved after seeing the success of Rodan getting their release, or their version of a giant monster film in Gorgo. And so I'm going to call on John to kind of take us through some of the production history of the film.
Yeah, and Matt, could you actually go to the next slide up? Just yeah, and we'll come back to that other one later because I'm sure that one's gonna distract a lot of people wondering why that's up there. So the King brothers, you know, like Matt said, after Rodan was a huge success, they just wanted to make their own monster movie. And the concept that they came up with was just that a monster gets captured by the circus. That's it. They did not come up with the mother monster and the infant. That would come later. And you know, as we said before, they teamed with a Japanese studio. And to this day, we still don't know for sure who the studio was, but like 95% chance at least that it just had to be Toho. Because you know, when I was younger, I for a while I thought, well, maybe Nikatsu was the studio that King Brothers teamed with because Nikatsu would later produce Gappa, the Triphibian monster, which is very similar to Gorgo. But now I don't think that's the case anymore because Nikatsu was not producing giant monster movies in the late 1950s when this was pitched. You know, Toho was really the only game in town. Dai had done Warning from Space or Spaceman Appears, which wasn't really a giant monster movie. So odds favor it had to be Toho. And even though Gorgo didn't come out until 1961, they got the ball rolling in the year 1958, and that's when the Japanese studio signed on. And the King brothers brought in Eugene Leray to write the script, you know, of course, because of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and The Giant Behemoth. And at the time, Leray was working on a sci-fi movie that would ultimately go unmade. It was called Moonwreck, and I have no idea what it's about, but I would guess it probably involved the moon falling from the sky or something. So even though we got Gorgo, we missed out on Moonwreck, whatever that was going to be. And I'm sure we'll talk about this again later, but I just have to say that Leray, when he got offered to do this third giant monster movie, he knew that what he wanted to do was to make one where the monster was basically good and it lived. And that's all because his little daughter was always so disappointed by the fact that the monster died at the end of Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So Leray, he teamed up with another writer named Daniel James, and they came up with a screenplay called Kuru Island. And that's Kuru, Kuru Island. And again, because the King brothers had it set up as a Japanese co-production, you know, they kind of stimulated to Leray that this needs to be set, you know, somewhere in Asia near Japan. So he set it on a South Pacific island, and eventually the action would transition to Tokyo. Now I have a couple of little synopses of the treatment that I want to read, just so you get it straight, you know, from the horse's mouth, so to speak. It was said to be set on a fictitious atoll in the South Pacific, where cultured pearls were the main export. After a tremendous storm and an underwater eruption, the baby creature surfaces and adheres to the island. Tidal waves and other phenomena mark the unbalancing of the environment. The beast was to have been captured and brought to a Tokyo zoo for observation when the mother beast surfaces to rescue it. Now, what that little synopsis doesn't mention is that they wanted the main characters were actually going to be pearl divers instead of sailors, and somehow it was going to be these pearl divers who would capture the baby monster and it would get taken to the Tokyo Zoo. And something that was really important to Leray was he didn't want it to be a real confrontational movie. He wanted it to be kind of more peaceful. And I have a quote from here, or I have a quote from Leray I want to read. He told Paul Mandel that I wanted the creature to confront human beings, but there were no scenes of the military shooting at it and not being able to destroy it. That concept is really ridiculous. The creature was not supposed to destroy the town, and there were no stock shots planned of military intervention. And anyways, though, the Kuru Island treatment was about 10 pages long. The Japanese studio, whoever they were, they signed off on it and accepted it in August of 1958. So Leray went to work on a full screenplay. However, in November of 1958, whoever the Japanese producers were, they suddenly backed out. And Matt, you can go ahead and go back to that War with Newt slide now. So, big reason why there's two reasons why we think it was probably Toho. So, you know, November of 1958 was just 1 month after Toho's lesser monster movie Varan had just been released into theaters. You know, Varan was not a hit. And on top of that, Varan had also started off as a co-production with ABPT Pictures in the U.S. And ABPT just kind of bailed on Toho, and I think it's possible that Toho had a sour taste in their mouth with monster movies at that time. And since Varan had been kind of a failed U.S. co-production, maybe it's possible they just did not want to get into another one. Now, as to why we have this odd slide up about War with Newts. So what happened there is we do have proof that Toho and the King brothers planned to do a co-production together in the late 1960s. And that does make sense because Toho was doing co-productions with U.S. studios at the time. And the proof is a 1967 issue of Castle of Frankenstein, which reported that Toho was producing a movie called From the Depths with the King brothers. And for many, many years, I wondered what From the Depths could be until I saw a Jim Danforth interview where Jim Danforth spoke about how the King brothers approached him to do an adaptation of Carl Capek's book, War with Newts. And War with Newts has a lot to do with underwater type stuff and surroundings. So to me, it makes sense that they just retitled War with the Newts to From the Depths for whatever reason. So uh, again, in 1967, Toho and King brothers were apparently planning on adapting this book, which is basically about intelligent salamanders. If you're interested in it, you can go Google it and read for yourself because we don't want to get too far off from Gorgo. But anyways, that's kind of our proof that at least at one point they were working together. And now, yeah, now you can go back to the pre-production slides. So once the Japanese studio bailed on King brothers, they decided to relocate the story to just basically anywhere outside of Asia. They considered Spain, Rome, but the first one they really settled on was Paris. That's where they wanted to take the story. And because it switched from Paris to the South Pacific, that meant the Pearl Divers would no longer work. And Eugene LeRay had some things to say about that. He said, after living intensely with my Japanese and Pacific native characters for 2 months, it was impossible for me to do a rewrite and change the locale to some European country. So LeRay, he didn't even rewrite the script or the concept. That fell to a writer named Robert L. Richards, although he did so under an alias. And now, as to Paris, the King brothers were the ones who were really excited about destroying Paris. And in an interview in 1959, Morris King said, "We are going to destroy Paris like it's never been destroyed before. Frank's dying to because of the prices, but Paris has something. Tokyo's already been destroyed, and so has Berlin, and King Kong has wrecked New York." And King also added that in trying to find her baby, the mother monster will wreck the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Louvre, the Opera, the Grand Palace, and 2 bridges on the Seine. Now, it was Eugene LeRay who kind of convinced them to move away from Paris, because LeRay explained to the King, to the King brothers that he said to them, "Think, Gene," Frank King said to Eugene LeRay, he said, "Think how spectacular it would be if the monster were to climb the Eiffel Tower." And LeRay then told King, that Paris is at least 250 miles from the sea. So that would mean Gorgo would have to walk 250 miles into Paris. And so that kind of made them realize maybe Paris isn't the best place. And so after Paris, they also briefly considered Australia. And as to why they didn't, one of the King brothers said, "There are no monuments in Australia, and besides, who cares if a monster destroys Australia?" And then finally, they decided on London, and that's when the final stages of the script began, to really get finished. And LeRay, he really wasn't happy with it. According to him, the story as originally conceived was far more poetic, but the King brothers butchered the idea entirely. And he also said, "It was enough to make me lose heart over the project, but I wanted to direct the film." And that's basically all of Gorgo's pre-production, up until the time that they got the story finalized. And also, Gorgo was going to be a quadruped at one point, as you can see from these pre-production drawings. But they probably dropped that because it's really hard to do quadrupeds via suitmation.
Do we know why they kept the suitmation? Was that just kind of a holdover from when it was a Japanese film?
I think so, yeah, and I think they just decided that stop motion would take too long, and they were probably already running behind on where they'd like to be.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot about Eugene Laurier at this point, but just to kind of elaborate and I guess talk a little bit more about you know, who he was. He was Russian born. He's primarily known as an art director and a production designer on many famous classic films. I mean, Sam Fuller's Naked Kiss and Shot Corridor, Charlie Chaplin's Limelight. He was also nominated for an Oscar for special effects for work on Krakatoa, east of Java. So that's more what he's known for. Of course, us giant monster fans, you know, we know him from the films that he directed. I had mentioned earlier, he kind of helped usher in the kaiju genre with Beast from 20,000 Fathoms with Ray Harryhausen. After that, he did The Giant Behemoth with Willis O'Brien. And he also did The Colossus of New York and, of course, Gorgo. And he's done a lot of he did a lot of artwork himself for Gorgo. And The Giant Behemoth as well, which I believe we have a slide of here. So yeah, he was also an artist. He's done some Gorgo art as well. I think that's our next slide. We have a portrait of the monster that he had drawn. But yeah, he really was trying to make a movie that his daughter would enjoy. You know, as John said, when she watched the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, she was heartbroken that the monster died. And so that brings us to the whole trope of, the giant parent coming to rescue the baby, which we've seen over and over again. We'll get to that later. And he never was happy, as John had mentioned, with the things that the King brothers had Robert Richards under the alias John Loring here. The changes he made to the script, the original script was a lot more focused on the imbalance of nature. And, he really wanted to lean off of the military stuff. In fact, Laurier actually did do an edit of the film himself before he got another job in 1960. The King brothers, they re-edited it. They added even more military stuff in the form of stock footage, including some of that stuff that was also stock footage used in Rodan. But he was never happy with the final film. In fact, in 1980, he acquired his own print of the movie that just so he could recut it himself. He took out a lot of the scenes he hated so much. It's unknown if he ever showed that to anybody. But yeah, he's definitely kind of an unsung hero in the history of giant monster films, and between this and The Beast, you have two movies that really set a precedent for everything that came after. The movie came out in 1961. I mentioned he did his first edit in 1960. The movie was actually finished in 1959. But it was held up for 2 years because the King brothers couldn't pay their investors back. And it actually opened in 1960 for the first time, though, in Japan. And it was huge in Japan. And there is speculation that maybe movies like Mothra might have been influenced by Gorgo. It's even been speculated that Gorgo's success in Japan might have even had a role in why they decided to bring back Godzilla. But getting into some other key members of the production here. A lot of Gorgo, I think, can be attributed to a lot of what works about it can be attributed to the cinematographer named Freddie Young, who is seen here on the right. Freddie Young is known as one of, I mean, his cinematography for David Lean's films like Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zavajo, which he won Oscars for, by the way, in addition to 2 other Oscar wins, is really known as some of the best cinematography, you know, some of the best filmed movies of, those are some of the best filmed movies of all time. And with Gorgo, he lends to it a really moody atmosphere, especially, you know, some of the scenes in the water are very kind of eerie. And he really gives the movie a really cool look. He also did the Bond movie, You Only Live Twice. And then the score was done by Angelo Lavagnino. I don't know how well I did with that name, but he's a very prolific Italian composer. He's done over 300 films. One of the most famous is Orson Welles' 1951 version of Othello. And then the movie has kind of a small cast. There's a lot of people in it, but there's really only a few key players. So, you know, the most relevant ones are these folks here. Bill Travers, who at the time was kind of a big star. I'm not sure how familiar people are with him these days, but you know, he's known for films like Born Free and Ring of Bright Water. He was actually an animal activist in real life as well. He's produced some documentaries and films about animals and nature. So his change of heart in the movie actually is kind of fitting. William Sylvester, to the right there. He was known for films like Todd Browning's Devil Doll, most known for his role in Stanley Kubrick's 2001. And then we also have the kid, Sean, who lends another trope used, especially by Japanese monster movies after this, of the child who builds the bond with the monster and understands the monster. But yes, Vincent Winter played him. He actually didn't act very much, especially after this, but he did go on to become an assistant director on movies like Richard Donner's Superman and The Dark Crystal. He was also a production manager on some big movies like Superman 3 and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So those are really the 3 most prominent actors. There's a lot of other familiar faces in the movie as well, but for the sake of time, you know, we're not gonna go over those. Sorry, Dorkins fans. So yeah, that's kind of those are some of the people in front of the camera. But I think we should talk about the special effects, which were pretty innovative for their time as well.
Matt, you're on mute.
You're on mute, bro.
There we go. There we go. Second time's charm. So Tom Howard did the special effects. People know him from Thief of Baghdad, 2001: Space Odyssey. But the cool thing about them moving to MGM, the British studios, was basically they had larger access to bigger sound stages. And one of the other things that's really interesting is that the suit itself it's not based on Godzilla. In fact, they kind of go out of their way to say they thought the Godzilla suit was a bit too clumsy, which, I mean, considering the weight of the first Godzilla suit, that would be accurate. The movement, the eyes, the movement of the eyes and the ears, and of course the tail were actually controlled independently, but actually also done from inside the suit. They had a hydraulic system with the control box on the inside. The suit was actually 8 feet tall. We know that 4 people played the creatures, although I believe only Mick Dillon has confirmed involvement. It's thought that probably David Wilding, Peter Brace, and Peter Perkins had all been in the suits at different times. One of the hardest things about walking with the suit as a giant webbed feet. The feet are just ginormous if you watch the film. And so they really had to be careful when they were on set doing that. And then, of course, they had a couple different actually water tanks on stage. They had a deep tank for the main stage. And then for shots with the monster actually in the water, they built tanks with 3 feet of water so that the suit actor could walk through there. And they also had specific tanks that were used for any of the scenes that were used for ships. In fact, they were basically they had this miniature ship and they would house water on it. They would also have the set with the crew. The other interesting thing is, of course, they employed the same sort of overcrank camera usage that Toho would use for Godzilla, where you speed up the film at a high speed so that when the monster destroys something, it looks like it's happening in almost like a slow motion to give it sort of weight. And that's a pretty common thing that Toho did for their films. Well, that was the same technique that was used here. And then for the scene where like mother and baby are actually leaving and they're walking through the city, the mother was shot on the master shot and against smaller miniatures. And then they actually shot the baby independently on a blue screen. They reduced the size of that, and then they printed that onto the master through the traveling matte process. And then they would composite like people into the actual shots themselves. So they had a bunch of extras. They would put them in there kind of fleeing through the city and things. And they also had, of course, we have a giant in Gorgo. We have a giant Gorgo that shows up. That was actually a full-size prop. So at towards the beginning of the film, when the Gorgo shows up the first time, you actually have this head that comes out, and then you have the giant hand. Those are gigantic props. Those are also the same props that would be put on the truck and kind of paraded through the city later on. The interesting thing about this is that the movie cost about $650,000, but it was also the most costly production of the King brothers at the time. It ended up canceling a rumored 30 projects. We don't know what those projects were per se, but they had spent so much money on this that they ended up canceling 30 other things that they had planned out. And then, of course, Byrd had mentioned the release of the film, even though it started in 59, well, because they couldn't pay their investors, it was delayed release by 2 years. Another thing that's important to note is that by moving the project from Paris to Britain, 1/3 of the taxes that would have been placed on the film were returned back to the producers, which is probably a financial incentive that they had to actually film in Britain as well. And I have some pictures I'm going to kind of go through, so just give me 1 second to get my screen shifted here. So here's here's one of the heads and kind of a production still. Here's some of the destruction scenes. You can see like the suit itself, massively, like the proportions are just massive, gigantic hands. I really love the fact that like you can get the ears, they move. They give it a lot of character that you don't always see in kaiju films. I think they do a really good job, especially considering this is one of the first giant monster movies that bring in this creature to life. It's really well done and put together. I love the creature design. I love the fact that the eyes glow. It's got a really unique feel to it. It doesn't, to me, feel like it's ripping off Godzilla. It feels really unique to itself. I think they did a great job of making something that's truly unique and memorable, and also, bringing it to life with. And there, by the way, there's the pool scene. That is actually 3 feet of water, so you can see like how big that suit actually was. It was 8 feet tall. One other thing is that they built the Dorkins, the circus thing. They actually had a set built. They had one live action set for the actors, and in the same studio, they had the miniatures basically right next to it. So that would have been kind of cool to actually see the circus itself and the actors doing everything in real time, and then you have the exact same set but miniaturized with Gorgo inside. I want to talk briefly about the promotion, because the promotion for this movie was actually fairly unique. So it did premiere in Japan, Tokyo specifically, before anywhere else. It was actually December 24th, 1960. And it did super well there. And so essentially, they had 25 theaters that were participating in the initial release in Japan. And then 75% of Japan's television stations were actually taking part in advanced promotion. So they actually promoted this well ahead of releasing it. The original idea was to release the subtitled version first and then go back and release a dubbed version so they could essentially have the movie come out twice and capitalize that way. Terry Turner, who worked for MGM, he was responsible for promoting the 1952 successful re-release of King Kong and promoting Godzilla King of the Monsters in 56. He was kind of the mastermind for also bringing this to the United States. The way they did this is they actually had two 20-foot cutouts of Gorgo with flashing eyes, and they kind of paraded those around. They also had the print in the famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. They also had 30 trucks with Gorgo advertising, which to me just it brings up shades of Godzilla 98 with all the different like buses and things. But they actually had trucks that had Gorgo advertising parading around the cities. And then in March 29th of 1961, you saw the wide release. And here in this slide, you can kind of see some specific cities like Cincinnati, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. They tried to market Gorgo on television well ahead of this, and they did like basically a really small release, but it did so well for them in that way. And so it's kind of just a unique way to really put together promotion and then release the film. And so there's some of the statues and some of the promos. And then, of course, you have, and the pictures aren't super great, but they have like the "It's Real, It's Alive." And it's just a really interesting, especially for 1960s, way to release a movie. And the fact that they did it kind of in sporadic areas of the country versus doing like a ginormous wide release, really rather brilliant, did well for them. And next, we're going to talk about comics. And so I'm going to hand this off to Kevin.
Yeah, Gorgo has a bit of a history and an interesting legacy in the comic book space. Basically, there was a Gorgo comic book from Charlton Comics, who now exists as a sort of subsidiary of DC Comics, basically. But at the time, they were independent, and they did a 23 issue run from 1961 to 1965, and then there were 3 additional issues of a spin-off. That the first issue was called Gorgo's Revenge, and then it got changed to Return of Gorgo. So every issue of this was written by Joe Gill, who you would know as the creator of a couple of now DC characters like Captain Atom and Peacemaker. And then 8 issues were illustrated by Steve Ditko, who at the same time, I mean, he did Gorgo, then he went off and he created Spider-Man, and then he did some more Gorgo, went off, created Doctor Strange, and it's just a little bit notable. So that's the big legacy that I think a lot of people are going to know these comics for in the current context. If you're a Kaiju fan, it's really interesting because Gorgo and Konga and Reptilicus, which was sort of 3 different European-based kaiju movies from the same time, all of those licenses wound up with Charlton, and they had kind of little itsy-bitsy crossovers between the characters here and there throughout their comic runs, which were all going on at the same time. Konga was also illustrated by Steve Ditko. And along with the original stories, if you had the Gorgo comic, there would be like a backup comic with different characters in the same magazine, etc. All of these comics are actually in the public domain now, so you can find them for free online, and there are all sorts of different reprints out there, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. So the first issue of Gorgo is just a retelling of the story that's in the first movie. But what I find is kind of interesting is it basically glosses over the attack with the mother Ogre coming in at the end, but it has an extended deleted scene because there's this bit that was in the original Gorgo script where they're doing their diving and there's an octopus that attacks and they see a killer whale and then they see the monster. That's not in the movie, but it made it into the comic book version, which I think is kind of neat. So, like I said, the first story is an adaptation of the movie, and that's what it is. But what I really get excited about is with the subsequent issues, where all of a sudden, you still have Ogre and Baby Gorgo swimming around the world, except now there are monsters from Venus, and there's an invasion from Atlantis, and there are robots and dinosaurs and atomic mutations and all of these other staples of the comic books of the early 60s. So you really get that sort of, monster of the month type of thing. You can see Reptilicus flying in the top middle on the yellow comic right there. So that's a little bit of a crossover right there an example for people looking for those sorts of things. And then even though they stopped making Gorgo in 1965, there is one final kind of cameo where a very similar creature shows up in Fighting 5 number 41. And additionally, long after that, because Steve Ditko made Gorgo and Konga comics, there's a little bit of a cameo in Web of Spider-Man annual in 1990, where a kid is shown playing with quote Gorgo and Konga toys. So because these are in public domain, you can find a whole lot of various reprints of various quality. A lot of people will simply go to the Internet Comic Book Archive, download them, and repackage them as a Kindle book or something like that. Sort of one of the earliest ones that you could find was Attack of the Mutant Monsters, which was published by A+ Comics. And that's kind of funny because they retitle the monster to be Kagor because I guess they're afraid of getting sued for using the name Gorgo. And that's only the first 1 and 3 issues in black and white. There's also the Ditko's Monsters that has 2 issues of Konga and 2 issues of Gorgo. I don't know who was responsible for that cover there. I think it might be a little bit questionable with the 2 of them coupling.
Gorgo smash.
Yeah, that was from IDW, but again, because these are noteworthy for comics fans, there are collections also from IDW. There's a collection of basically Steve Ditko's issues that are all together. But then there's another collection that just came out last year that's Joe Sinnott and Joe Gill, who were inkers on Jack Kirby's stuff for Fantastic Four at the same time. So those are mutually exclusive collections, but you still don't have like the whole shebang in one package. Now, Charlton also was in the novel business. They had a subsidiary called Monarch Books, and they released their novelization of Gorgo quite a bit before the film's release. And this is written by a pulp magazine guy, Bruce Cassidy, under the name of Carson Bingham. And for people that know Monarch's books, because they also did adaptations of Reptilicus and Konga and Brides of Dracula, these have got a lot of gratuitous sex scenes. And you might be saying, but wait, there aren't any female characters in Gorgo. And Bruce Cassidy's got you covered because he invents a female character just for Sam to have sex with in the course of this book. And it is, in fact, such a selling point for the book that the description on the cover has a whole paragraph about the virginal Moira McCartan before it talks about, you know, a giant monster being a part of the story. Another interesting gimmick with their books is that they were scented. I guess they thought that that would make them smell better. So there are accounts that this book apparently smelled like bubble bath when it was put on shelves.
That's so bizarre. I can't.
Yeah. So as Matt was saying earlier, the initial release for Gorgo was in December of 1960 in Japan. And then it had a wider release in January of '61, and this is the premiere release of the film. So it was quite successful at the time, and kind of got a lot of buzz behind it, and it's remained in the popular consciousness to a bit. It's always been a little bit on the outskirts compared to the Japanese homegrown products, but it still shows up on festival screenings. Oftentimes on double bill with Gappa, which is a very similar movie, but strangely enough, it's had a tendency to show up on double bill with Q the Winged Serpent from 1982. I guess just because they're both foreign dinosaur movies about creatures on the loose. Gorgo has made a bunch of appearances, kind of in little cameo forms and small things here and there. and always in this sort of context of, oh, these are foreign monsters. So you can see from magazines here, there's like a map of where there's different kaiju around the world, and Gorgo's the representative for Ireland. Or on the cover of Monster Panic, where you can see fighting a Harryhausen monster. There was a whole series of drawings of Western and Japanese kaiju fighting each other. So you have Gorgo versus Gilala there, and here's there's one up there with her fighting Jaws, and Gorgo gets a little bit of a cameo in Hiroshi Yamamoto's Monster Magnitude 9 novel. Not stated by name. She's referred to as Eugene, but if you read between the lines, knowing who the director of the movie is, you can figure out what they were going for there. I do think it's interesting that Ogra, that name, the Ra at the end, that's just like any given Japanese kaiju. Looking at Gojira, Mosra, etc., Ghidorah. So if you look at the, as Byrd was saying earlier, there's a whole lot of influences and then plausible influences and kind of lines that we can connect. Everybody makes a big deal about the similarities between Gorgo and Gappa, but the writers of Gappa insist that they had not seen the movie at the time. So
yeah, right.
Well, we'll have to take them at their word, I guess. On the other hand, you have the scene at the end of Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2. Actually, on the Gorgo Japanese DVD release, they say that the scene with the full-grown Godzilla walking away with the baby Godzilla into the ocean, and you see the two of them, that was directly inspired by Gorgo. We don't have a definitive answer on the 1983 Godzilla King of the Monsters 3D about whether there was influence there or whether Fred Decker was channeling that, but I would not be surprised. There's also a dinosaur monster called Gorgo and Eisenborg, but there's also a real dinosaur that kind of looks like that called the Gorgosaurus. So, whatever. Now, we talked a little bit about little Godzillas, and we know that Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, or Godzilla King of the Monsters 3D, was not the first baby Godzilla. No, this was, in fact, from 1957 in a manga called Saigo no Gojira from Yoshiharu Hashimoto. And this is one of the things that we point to as what are the chances that this was originally a Japanese co-production with Toho? And there's a lot of similarities in this manga, especially if you think about the context at the time. That this manga starts off with Godzilla going on a rampage through Tokyo. Then they find out that it's just a baby. And then the adult obviously comes to rescue the baby because the baby's in trouble. There's a scene where the monsters are destroying a zoo. The entrepreneurs at the zoo want to capture, drug Godzilla and put him on display. And then, there's this end scene where the monster and the baby go off into the ocean together. And if you think about the way that kaiju movies tended to end at that time, they usually ended with the monster getting destroyed. I mean, aside from The Lost World, pretty much the standard ending for a kaiju movie was the monster going up in flames. So this is kind of a change of things, and a change that you see reflected in Gorgo as well. And really an inflection point, because this changes right after Gorgo. Along similar lines, the whole idea of the monster getting captured is obviously something from The Lost World and from King Kong. But if you watch the original King Kong, it kind of glosses over the whole transportation of the monster thing. But in Gorgo, they make a big parade of taking the monster through the city, etc. You can see similar deals in Spectre Man and in Gamera the Brave, and honestly kind of also in King Kong versus Godzilla the next year. And you can make a case also for Mothra, because that's also, the Shobijin get captured and then Mothra shows up to rescue them. It's all sort of a very similar vibe, and how much one influences the other is kind of hard to tell. There are possible concurrent evolutions of the things, but definitely I've seen people saying that, oh, especially like the Gamera and Spectre Man things seem very much like they are homage to Gorgo, especially because they built these huge props that they, you know, display to the actual public. And as Byrd alluded to earlier, we have this trope for I don't know, maybe younger kaiju fans aren't familiar with this term, the Kenny, who is this little precocious child that manages to hang out with all of the adults and not just get thrown in a broom closet somewhere for being annoying. And you will see these all over in kaiju movies in the 1960s, this sort of like wish fulfillment little boy character. And Gorgo is really one of the first primary examples that you get there, you know, kind of opens the door. So Sean, you are open up the glass ceiling for obnoxious children.
Thanks, Sean.
So this is actually from one of the posters from Gorgo. It was released in the UK in October 27th. But notice the X rating right there, which means that anybody who was under the age of 16, they couldn't see the movie if you went to the theater, which was a big deal for the Kings brothers, because you got to remember they love money and they loved laundering money apparently. So because of that, it actually ended up probably costing them a little bit at their, you know, the place where the movie was filmed, which I thought was kind of a neat little tidbit. Here's some of the production art you kind of have, and you also have one of the stills from the film with the prop hand coming up. There's also a premiere party, so that you can kind of see like the primary audience still being kids. But again, that kind of highlights that crazy TV campaign that they had. And then here's just some of the different, you know, posters, promotional materials. The one looks suspiciously like Godzilla.
Yes.
It's interesting to see Gorgo and Konga match together even back then.
Yeah.
You also have...
That's not Gorgo.
That's, yeah. Gorgo El Monstro / Gamera. The different like posters are always super incredibly fascinating, because you have like, you know, King Kong showing up in some of the Godzilla stuff that isn't actually a King Kong movie and vice versa. It's really bizarre.
Anyone who hasn't seen the movie, Gorgo does not breathe fire.
It's fine. Here's some of the VHS releases. I had the Video Treasures one. Can't speak for the rest of y'all, but I had the one on the far right.
The one on the left is doing some Exorcist.
Yeah, I don't know what he's up to. Here's that famous Monsters of Filmland. That's one of the 1961 version that they heavily used to promote the movie. And then you have again one of the Gorgo VHS tapes. Hey, look, there's Godzilla fighting Superman. Gorgo, I don't. Yeah, so here's
Son of Godzilla and Godzilla versus Megalon in European releases.
That actually just gets so confusing for anybody that actually goes to that movie.
That's the idea.
So Kevin, we'll turn back to you to talk about the this legacy piece.
So yeah, Gorgo outside of Japan also has an interesting, you know, kind of legacy, and it's, you know, influences on movies. I think a couple that people might be familiar with is there is sort of the mockbuster of Godzilla in 1998 called Gargantua. There was a TV movie that had a very similar premise with the baby dinosaur and the adult coming to rescue it. But then also in the same time frame, you had the Steven Spielberg movie, The Lost World, which is a sequel to Jurassic Park, which had the T-Rex baby getting rescued by the mother, and they were very upfront in saying, "Hey, Gorgo was an inspiration for this."
Kevin, real quick, even on the documentary for the making of the first Jurassic Park, Spielberg name drops Gorgo. So I guess the sequel, that's where he was able to indulge in that.
U.S. Senator for Maine, Angus King, no relationship as far as I can tell with the King brothers, had an ad campaign where he used footage from Gorgo for some reason. It's these ads where he's like, "I'm not a monster," and then plays footage from Gorgo. And then you see these little cameos throughout pop culture, you know, in Felix the Cat, in the Dinosaurs Attack Trading Cards, and the animated movie Teen Titans Trouble in Tokyo. They fight a monster that's very similar. So you see these kind of little shades throughout pop culture all over the place.
Yeah, and just some other stuff. I mean, Mystery Science Theater did a Gorgo episode. I'm a big Mystery Science Theater fan. Gorgo was the first time they did one. Now, in my head, I was thinking, like, this is almost too good to be on this show. But that also had a little appearance by the famous film critic Leonard Malton. You see him in the left image there, who actually came on before to talk about how good of a movie Gorgo actually is, in that little segment on Mystery Science Theater. And of course, that's pretty easy to find.
Well, for a while it wasn't. It only aired on TV once.
Yeah, do we know why? I'm not sure why.
It was
I actually have
with the GM.
It's funny, I somewhere I have a VHS taping of that because I did record that. Anyway, some other things. A lot of people don't know that John Carpenter, of course, amazing horror filmmaker, when he was getting into, you know, making his own movies, he did little shorts, you know, as a teenager with his camera at home. And one of the little movies he made as a teenager was a Gorgo versus Godzilla fan film. So there is a Gorgo versus Godzilla fan film by John Carpenter in existence that, you know, Carpenter has said, you know, no one will ever see these, you know, because they were, you know, just, you know, movies he made when he was really young, that were amateur things. So I don't know what they would have been like. I'd imagine if people are familiar with the fan films of Don Bluth, you know, John Carpenter had mentioned mentioned Don Bluth as an early influence, and Don Bluth made these very crude little fan films, many of them without audio, where he would have toys or clay figures that he would have fight. So I'd imagine it'd be kind of like that. But yeah, I don't know. It'd be neat to see, just as a curiosity. And then there was also a short film, which I guess you could call a fan film, Waiting for Gorgo, which isn't so much a giant monster piece, but it's a short film from 2009 that kind of serves as really a critique on unnecessary military spending. And the whole short is just how after the attack from the first Gorgo movie, they established this this group in the government that would be there just to monitor giant monster activities. And there's been no giant monsters since Gorgo and Ogra left. And the department has been whittled down to only 2 old men who their job is literally to sit there and wait for Gorgo to come back. And it's all about this person who's evaluating their expenses, saying, like, why are you, you know, what purpose do you have? And, you know, it's a funny little short. It's available online. So I'd recommend people check that out as well.
If you don't get the joke, Google Waiting for Godot.
And of course, here's some merch. I think we see a little more these days, but you know, I remember the M1 vinyl figure, the Japanese company M1. There's a tiny little Palmer figure there. There's an Aurora kit, and I know there's been various models and toys over the years. You know, in recent years, there's been more as more interest in the genre grows. So Gorgo lives on. The end. And there they are. So thank you, everybody. John and Kevin, thanks for being guests for this discussion. And hopefully people rediscover Gorgo.
You can also check out kaijumasterclass.com for the rest of the schedule this evening. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. And we will see you during the next session.
All right.